Probably most of you already know our speakers tonight, Scott Prince, who has been a longtime advocate of climate in our community, and Bruce Lehrman, who has been very much the same, along with developing ideas for transportation and community involvement. So, believe it or not, this night tonight is really about community development. It's about how we configure our life as a Bennington community in this changing environment that we are going to be in. And make no mistake, we are going to be in a changing environment. So without further ado, Scott Prince will get us started this evening, and we'll do questions at the end of each presentation, unless you have absolutely a burning question that you have to get out right now. We will have a brief break in the middle to adjust a little power situations here. So have a little time, and and then you can get more coffee.
I'm just getting my things set here. All right, I'm not using a microphone. I'm going to be speaking up. Hopefully Nathan will hear me on the video camera. If anyone has a problem hearing me, let me know, but I'm a soft-spoken guy. I'll do the best I can. When Jerry approached Bruce and I a few months ago about doing another presentation, it's like, sure, no problem, but then when you start working on such a thing, you wonder what you might have gotten yourself into. As I was telling someone just before, a few minutes ago, I can understand why I would never become an oncologist. I can't imagine telling people particularly bad news, and here I am again, and it's not a pleasant thing to be doing. Have a lot of material to get through, and to do such a thing, I'm going to probably be reading off my notes a lot instead of ad-libbing, so we can move along at a good pace. If anyone has any questions on anything I said, something's not clear, just stop me. We'll try and get to it real quick and then keep right on going, okay? Can everybody hear me for the most part? Okay. Jerry asked me to speak about energy, economics, and the environment, anything in that realm. I figure most people here are probably interested in the environment, in particular climate change, so I'm going to be focusing on that, but I will be touching on a spectrum of things this evening. When it comes to climate change, it'll be our responses and some of the obstacles we're facing, consequences of our responses, constraints of meaningful responses, and reason for this is many of these are not getting much, if any, attention, and they are huge issues that can interfere with what we're trying to do. The point of this is not to bring us to a point of despair, but to provide some clarity of where we are so we can choose worthwhile endeavors using our limited resources and time that we do have available to us. Let's get going here. So, you might be familiar with this. This is the Serenity Prayer. Give us the courage to change what can be changed, the serenity to accept what cannot be changed, and the wisdom to know one from the other. You came here tonight, you have courage. Trust me, you do. You might not feel it yet, but if you listen to myself at least, I don't know about Bruce, but you demonstrated that. I think Bruce is going to be working a little bit more on the serenity end and maybe some wisdom. I'm hoping to focus on recognizing what cannot be changed and accepting that to some extent. So efforts to combat climate change have been likened to building interstate systems, FDR's New Deal, the Apollo mission, and of course a war effort. I'm going to dwell on the war effort. I think there's a lot of things that are a little closer to what we're facing here. This is an existential challenge we're facing. It's not a political thing or an economic battle that we're on like some of those other things were. In war planning, there is no room for denial or wishful thinking. honesty, clarity of objectives, acknowledging the sacrifices required, humility that you have imperfect knowledge. These things are all critical in war planning, and I think they're all critical for what we're facing now also. There's also just myriad interrelated factors that need to be considered. You know, a lot of people like to focus on one narrow aspect, but with everything connected, like it is in ecological situation, you really need to be open to all sorts of things. There's nothing that probably should be excluded. If you go back to the Apollo mission, it'd be like ignoring gravity, or if you're trying to build interstates and not knowing about soil or wetlands, it would be pointless to try and go forward. If you're interested, you're going to be seeing this guy a lot in your background. This is the West African battle during World War II. That is a brigadier from Britain who's laying out plans to go against the Axis. His name is Brigadier Ronald Scobie, if anybody cares. So, unlike war planning, though, we have some other issues that actually make it a lot harder for us. We have no central authority. In wars, there's a chain of command that goes down. There's someone that's saying what's going to happen and what the objectives are. We don't have that. Another problem we have is multiple objectives. We want to fight climate change. Even that one single thing, it's not really clear. We try to stay under a certain temperature, try to keep sea levels from a certain spot, trying to keep our emissions below a certain level, trying to save polar bears, whatever it is. But then there are other objectives that a lot of people throw in. We want to maintain our lifestyles. We want egalitarian, progressive economic systems for all our people. We want democracies. In war, there's one objective. It's to win. We don't have that going for us either. Myriad complicating factors and consequences. I've already talked about that. Healthcare, investments, education, you name it. Everything is touching one another. Other thing we have going on, people that are seeking to solve the problem are also part of the problem. I don't know about you, I drove here tonight. I'm wearing synthetic clothing. I ate food that wasn't produced on my land. I mean, all of us are part of this whole system and taking advantage of fossil fuels all the time. There is no discernible point of failure or success. In a war, there's key battles. You win a city, you win some territory, you surrender or are surrendered to. We don't have such a thing going for us. It's not clear when we win or when we lose. It's a very gray spectrum over centuries, decades, years, who knows. Because of that, we lose the sense of urgency that goes with a lot of battles. We have people all the time, is it 1.5 degrees by 2030? Is it 1.5 degrees by 2100? Nobody really knows what it's supposed to be. And despite not being urgent, we also know that time is running out. We know the situation is getting worse. We know it's happening at a faster rate. So we're going to use the latest report from the IPCC that came out in December. This is from the meeting in Poland you probably heard about. And I'm going to draw a few things out of the summary report that they had. They talk about limiting warming to 1.5 degrees as possible within the laws of chemistry and physics, but doing so would require unprecedented changes. Just that one line, there were three things that jumped out at me. This 1.5 degrees Celsius, the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change under the United Nations, they don't even define what the baseline is. We don't know if that's 1.5 degrees from now, or from pre-industrial times, or from somewhere in between. Here's the graph of what we've been looking at so far. They probably were referring to something like 1900 or late 1800s, but if they're referring to where we are now, which is already 1 degree from these times here, there isn't much room left. So it struck me that they would use that language. They also said possible within the laws of chemistry and physics, as if that's it. There's biology, there's anthropology, there's geology, there's all sorts of other ologies going on here. To frame it like this makes it sound like it's an extreme engineering problem, and that's all. It's not. This is an ecological situation that we're in with ramifications everywhere. This type of framing, I already said something along those lines. So this kind of framing also would make it seem like we can be engineers and control the environment, which is perhaps part of what got us into situations like this to begin with. But who knows, it's possible the emission of all those other things was to put a point on it if it were only a chemistry and physics problem, and we have more than that. The other thing is they mentioned this unprecedented, which is an interesting choice of words, I thought, because usually you refer to something that's happened that has never happened before, never before known or experienced. To speak of something in the future that you're planning to accomplish as being unprecedented is not really instilling a lot of confidence that what you're looking to do is going to happen. So another part of that same summer report, they're talking about to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, far-reaching rapid transitions, land energy industry, transportation, cities, everything pretty much has to change that we know. And that would be requiring 45% reductions by 2030. That's 11 years from now. But they're saying from 2010 levels. Well, since 2010, our emissions have gone up. So it's really more like 50% we have to lose of our emissions in the next 11 years. That's about 1% every month, or every 3 months. Actually, it's a little faster than that, but that gives you a sense of things. We have not dropped emissions at that rate on that ongoing basis in modern times. It does happen once in a while when there's a significant financial crisis. We can do that for several months, maybe a year. It's very painful. If you think back 10 years ago, that was a time when such a thing happened. Some of you, many of you were here last year when I talked a lot about what was happening in the Arctic. I'm going to touch on a little bit of that right here. The trends that are going on. This has to do with the timing of things. We have 2030 if we go with what the IPCC said to lose about 50% of our fossil fuel emissions. So this is in the time frame 30 years from 1980 to 2010. That was the average sea ice at the Arctic in the end of summer. That's the lowest extent. Obviously, in the early years, 1980s, it was probably a little broader than this, and towards 2010 it might have been in a little bit. That's the average of those 30 years. Next slide is showing us what it looks like just a few years ago in 2016. Clearly, it's a lot less area. You probably heard the positive feedbacks. There's some significant positive feedbacks that happen here. The largest one is the albedo. That's the reflectance at the North Pole is dropped. Because of that, you're going to have even greater warming taking place. Also, with larger spans of open water, you're going to have more wave action that's going to cause erosion on the edges of the ice. There's many other feedbacks that go along with that. You're going to have a greater warming of the waters around here. Some of you may have heard of the tremendous amount of methane that's laying under the East Siberia Sea up here. There's concerns what could happen if that warms up enough that you could have methane, which is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas that could come up into the atmosphere. The other thing that's happening is because of the ice being smaller up here, the air temperatures up here are warmer, and that means that there's less snow on land. That's also raising lowering the albedo, less reflectance, and even further heating that's taking place. So what happens when this continues to contract is the way the winds travel around from going from the equator to the North Pole, it changes around. You lose some strength in the jet stream, and then you get the polar vortex that tends to wander off of the North Pole. We've seen some of that this year. Don't take too much that's proof of anything that I'm talking about here. There's weather that's going on too, but we're seeing a lot more of that over recent years, so there could be some correlation going on there. Certainly reason to expect there will be more of that going forward. So, oops, back up one. This is what's happening to the extent of the ice. This is the end of summer, September up there, and it's showing how back in 1980 we were up at somewhere around 8 million square kilometers. It's pretty clear that in the 90s it's lower, and then it's accelerating downward to hit zero somewhere out there if you were to continue that on. Extents is only 2 dimensions though. That's just across and wide. And what we're really concerned about, where I am, is what's happening in that 3rd dimension. There isn't as much old ice at the Arctic. It's getting thinner. And you'll notice that this went from 15,000 cubic kilometers approximately in the 80s, and now we're under, typically under around 5,000 cubic kilometers. If you do a straight line projection, that takes us out to a little past 2030, excuse me. But polynomial actually fits this better, and given that everything is happening at a faster rate than it has in the past, this is probably a little more realistic. This last year bumped up a little bit a few months ago, so instead of hitting a little before 2023, it's now hitting slightly after 2023. This is a huge problem. Once there is no ice there at the end of the summer, all the heating that went into melting the ice is now warming up water. If you have a glass of ice water on your counter and a glass of water on your counter that's at 32 degrees, they will both measure 32 degrees. If you let them sit there for an hour, you're still going to have a lot of ice in that one. The other one is getting warmer and warmer and will be much closer to room temperature. Same thing is going to happen at the North Pole, and because of that, the temperatures up there can go from 32 degrees in the end of summer to 40, 50, 60 degrees very quickly. It will cool down again as the winter comes on, but you're going to have a tremendous amount of heat up there to just destroy the weather systems. So this is what's going on in the atmosphere. You saw this if you were here last year. This is the Keeling curve, and this shows atmospheric carbon. This isn't what we're putting out. This is just what's in the atmosphere. It could be coming from a variety of sources. Most of it's man-made. The oscillations here are between winter and summer. There's more vegetation in the northern hemisphere. When that happens, there's a lot more carbon that gets into the vegetation. And in the winter, when they die off, the carbon dioxide will spike up. And here we are going along from well under about 315 and coming up a little short. This is actually, I think, around 411, 412 in the last week. Here's another way of looking at the same thing. This is the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere each year, parts per million, that's being added. Not added, but the difference from one year to the other. We've been adding more than this actually. And you can see from 1960 up through the current time, the tendency, the average line, it's going up. It's going at a faster rate than ever before. This next one shows,
Scott,
yes.
So in that past slide,
Yep.
what happened in that 1 year? What was
Right here,
going on?
1991?
Yeah.
A lot of this is weather. Are there volcanoes? Are there El Nino, La Nina? What's going on? Those sorts of things. Economy. If the economy slows down, tanks a lot. Actually, if you might recall, that wasn't a particularly good time right around here for the United States. You know, the other thing you could ask is what happened in 1998 and 2015. There's all sorts of things going on. Any 1 year or two probably isn't really a good thing. That's why I like taking at least 10, 15 years when you're looking at stuff like this. This next one will show what we've actually put out. This is through fossil fuel burning, cement making, all that stuff. So what we've put out, these units, if you can see this here, right here, this is 0, and this is 1,000 billion tons of carbon dioxide. And this is what's remained in the atmosphere. The difference here has been mostly going into water. Some of it goes into mineral form with rocks and so on. The interesting thing, I think, is that's when the Rio Summit was held. And there's Kyoto right there, well, 1994, I think it was. Copenhagen was there. Here's Paris. That was pretty recent, right? Well, look at what's happened. If you look at these straight line projections, they continue to tip up. It doesn't matter how often we meet and understand and talk about things. Things are accelerating, or at least what we're doing is. Even this, about a month ago, you probably saw all sorts of papers that are talking about 2018, where our emissions are up again, and I think it was at 2.7 or 2.8% over the previous year. Just keeps going. Another thing I had from last year, this is a key thing for timing. This is the atmosphere's time lag to having increased carbon dioxide going into it. Units are a little weird here. It's 1,000th of a degree Kelvin for every billion tons of carbon that go into the atmosphere. How long does it take for the maximum effect to take place? So if we put carbon, a billion tons in today, we can expect 1,000th of a degree to peak right around here. This white line is the average of 6,000 models that they did. And this averages out to somewhere in the 6 to 12 year range. Figure 9 or 10 years is about the peak there. And you can also see the carbon dioxide, the effect of it. While it does drop off a little bit in the few years after that, it goes out and goes out and goes out. We got centuries and centuries before this comes anywhere close to zero again after it's gone out. So it's a long-term effect. The other thing of interest here, though, is carbon dioxide that we're putting out right now, that extra 2.7% that we added last year, that's not going to have its full effect for about another 10 years. Essentially, a year shy of 2030, our goal for knocking our emissions down by half. Other complicators, aerosols. I talked about this a little bit last year. I'm going to try and get through this quick. Doing okay on my time, I think. Aerosols are tiny little particulate matter that gets into the atmosphere. A lot of it's natural. It can come from sand. It can come from all sorts of just dust off the earth, from deserts, from overplowing fields. You think of like dust type things. It can also be little bits of moisture. Pollen is considered an aerosol. Burning of coal puts out a lot of aerosols, besides a lot of carbon dioxide. These come in all varieties, shapes, and sizes. There's another thing that puts out a lot. It's burning of bunker fuels or heavy long-chain hydrocarbons. Even our hospital, until quite recently, was burning number 6 fuel oil. This stuff that these ships burn and the hospital used to burn is somewhere between like molasses and tar. It's so thick, to run it into the engines, they have to preheat the stuff so it'll flow. And same with the hospital, they had to do the same sort of thing. Tremendous amount of particulate matter in this, and that stuff stays in suspension, the aerosols do, for anywhere from a few days to several weeks, maybe a few months on some of the very light materials. Problem is, those aerosols have a net effect. You wouldn't think this is a problem, but it is. They have a net effect of cooling down the earth. So if we look at this, this is the radiative force. Anything up, we can think of as bad. It's causing warming. Anything that goes down, we can think of as being a positive thing. It's helping to keep the sun out a little bit. Things like clouds and so on. So here's carbon dioxide and methane, some halocarbons, and then there's other effects. This is the net effect. We can ignore that one for the moment. The sun, yes, the sun has actually gotten a little bit brighter. That's that little tiny bit that we're seeing here. But aerosols, right here, these two, notice they are the biggest two that are going down. Great thing, right? No. They only stay in the air for a limited period of time. If you stop burning coal and stop burning those bunker fuels and those heavy hydrocarbons, this goes away in weeks, months maybe at most. That goes away. This net effect of all of these added up will now go up to here. Just like that. If you want to get another, what does that work up to? That's watts per square meter. It's not degrees, but you get the idea that you're going to quickly add some more temperature, and that's very quick response stuff.
Where are cows in that?
Cows?
Cows, nothing.
Cows would probably occur over here in this category. Yeah, there's a lot of sources of methane that are variables here, but you can see in the grand scheme of things, at least at current levels, that's not a key player. Carbon dioxide and the negative effect of aerosols are the big factors. 20,000 research papers a year approximately are written on climate change. The IPCC looks at about 6,000 of those seriously. Tremendous amount of information that's not looked at. Also, everything is connected. There's just so much stuff to consider. Someone decided, let's look at aerosols a little bit better. And what they found, this is just weeks ago, they've been modeling aerosols over land and how they react. Well, they looked at it over water bodies, the ocean. The ocean's over 70% of the earth. Seems like something that would be worthwhile to do. They did this and they found, oops, aerosols take on moisture when they are over bodies of water. That causes them to reflect more than they thought, by a factor of about 2.5. You put that with the land, it's a net effect of about 2. These values here, these aren't correct. This is from a few years ago. These things should be about down here, should be about double what you're seeing. That means we've been wrong. The effect of all these things added up, going to this, well, this is what we know this is what we have, and we now know that these are bigger. That means something over here must be bigger than we knew about. And this is the culprit right there probably, is carbon dioxide. The radiative forcing, the climate sensitivity to carbon dioxide is greater than a lot of models currently have going, is the thought. You knock out aerosols that are down here, instead of going up to this level, you're now going up even further. Going on to the next thing, doing energy substitutions. Have to do this stuff fast. How does it work? Gentleman Cesar Marchetti, back in the 70s, doing energy research for countries, not an independent company or thing. And he was looking at how fast we transition from wood to coal to oil to natural gas to, at that time he referred to it as 21st century technologies, solar, hydrogen, what is he thinking? Nuclear. And he found some very interesting things. The time it takes for an energy source to go from 1% to 10% of the market share, that's from here to here, tends to be about 40 to 50 years. The time it takes for an energy source to occupy about 50% from the time it was 1%, that would be from here up to not quite 50% on this one, is about a century. There's a lot of reasons for that, and we're going to touch on that real quick here in just a couple minutes. Another nifty thing, back in 1990, this is quadrillions of BTUs from the big energy sources. Renewables is lumping a whole bunch of things together, but we're just going to go with that for now. Nuclear's been the low one all along. Petroleum, oil is up there. Coal bounced around a lot. You tend to think coal didn't go up this much. Well, this is not that long ago, and coal went up a fair amount. So from 1990 to 2018, renewable energies actually went up 75%, which sounds pretty impressive. Unfortunately, fossil fuels, these top three, from 1990 over here, they went up 70%. Total energy consumption went up, I think I have that here, 75% from 1990 to where we are over here. Yes?
Is that because of countries catching up in wealth and
A lot of this coal is China and India in
Right.
particular. That's what you're seeing here. Another thing I like to point out is that little dip or flat spot, as it would be, that was the great financial crisis. Renewables almost rode it out. Nuclear didn't go anywhere because it just doesn't go anywhere anymore. So while renewable energies were up 75%, fossil fuels still went up 70%. The net contribution of fossil fuels went from 86% to 83%. 28 years to go down 3 little ticks. So how come it takes so long? Well, we have entire industries that do things. You can't just change this in a short period of time. The jets are an interesting thing. There's really no viable way to run those without fossil fuels. The amount of time it takes to redesign something is huge. This is a 787, I believe, that's being built. From the time they first had the concept of 787 to the time the first one was flying was about 9 years. We have 11 years, so it gives you a sense of aircrafts. Of course, we don't even know what we would do for aircraft, but it's the same thing for all sorts of other technologies that are heavily reliant on fossil fuels. I'm sorry this chart is several years old. This is in the United States, what we have for autos, light trucks, heavy trucks, and air carriers. Those are like the jets we just saw. Heavy trucks are going to be semis, big trucks where you need licenses. Light trucks are going to be our SUVs and stuff that everyone's driving around now. Obviously, the share of light trucks is up a fair amount. It's total cars now is almost even in terms of new sales. I think it's even higher than this now. Heavy trucks has also gone up a fair amount. That's largely because we've gone to just-in-time delivery systems. You know, the whole Amazon model requires more trucking to get things everywhere that we're doing. And then the fleet sizes are also off a little bit. All these numbers are up. These two, I think, are up quite a bit. Yeah. The point here, though, is the average age of this stuff This now is a little over 10 years. This is coming up on 9, and I think this is close to 10 years, are the modern figures of these things. So if you want to have half of these gone in the next 10, 11 years, you need to start now. And pretty much every vehicle that is sold right now cannot use fossil fuels. From right now, this instant, near 100% of everything that goes on the roads, because people hold on to these things for years. I don't know what kind of cars you're driving. In my family, we have a 8-year-old car. We're pretty much in that range, and we have another one that's only 7 years old. But look around, you'll see a lot of old cars. Here's another great example. A lot of you have probably seen these oil burners in your houses. These things, if they don't last at least 20 years, you're going to be pretty annoyed. Having one last 30 years is not difficult to do at all. Some of them might be 50 years old in some of the houses. They cost several thousands of dollars. A new one maybe costs $5,000, $6,000 to get installed. If you just put one of these in 5 years ago, you're not going to be replacing before 2030. You're going to be holding on to that thing. I'm not picking on trucks here. I'm picking on roads. Bitumen, the material that's used for asphalt roads, about 1 million barrels a day is used for asphalt production, mostly for roads. The other material that's used for roads is cement. Cement uses a tremendous amount of energy. Currently, only about 6% of the energy used in concrete comes from renewable sources, and that's primarily hydroelectric. 70% from right now is from coal. The IEA's forecast for 2030 is 17% will be from renewables. Yet the CO2 will only drop 1.5% because of ever increasing production expectations with growing populations. Oops, skipped one there, back up. Another concern we have is food. Pre-industrial times, a person could invest 1 calorie of their muscle power and create 5 calories of food for someone to eat. There's a reason we had a lot of farmers, because it took a lot of muscle to get that, but it worked out for us. Currently, we are using 10 calories of energy to make 1 calorie of food. And this is coming almost exclusively from fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are used for pesticides, they're used for fertilizers, they're used for pumping water, they're used for all the machinery on a farm, which cannot easily be replaced with anything electric because you can't haul batteries around in the fields and try and get anything done. It's a huge problem here. This is we're 50 times less effective than we were beforehand. We don't notice this. It was 2/3 of the people who are involved in farming. How many knows someone that's a farmer 100% of their life? See a couple people that are farmers, but I'm not sure they do it 100% of the time. This is a huge problem. We have to get rid of 50% of the energy that's used here in 11 years if we want to eat and not destroy the environment.
How much does that do to government supports?
Government supports?
Yeah, the $10, the 10 calories. In other words,
This here?
you're paying people to be inefficient by keeping prices high. I'm just saying, we've got a whole system that's...
Without the energy that we're putting into our food system, we would not have the food that we have today. It's really that simple. Government subsidies and stuff, I mean, those might skew things a little bit here and there, but if we did not put all this energy into our food, we wouldn't get this out.
So if you had carbon taxes that actually charge people for the energy they're using, as opposed to being paid for by the government subsidies, you would see us go hungry.
I'm not sure how you're going to do this on a farm. Tractors and harvesters, they can't practically run on electricity. And all the petrochemicals that we use we're using soil that is worthless to farm on. And the reason we're able to do that is because we're injecting so much chemistry into that to make it work. I mean, government subsidies might help that, but the truth of the matter is the food's not going to be there if it's not done. So everyone likes to talk about how much carbon dioxide is associated with food. Grazing beef, it's about 50, 60 pounds of carbon dioxide is emitted for every pound of food you get. But that's not a reason to become a vegetarian. This is a reason not to do industrial farming. That's the thing to take from this. It's not eating meat is bad. I mean, we're omnivores. Look, our teeth are meant for this sort of thing. We might eat too much meat or something, but the problem is not eating meat, it's how we do it. Healthcare, drugs, feedstock for most drugs, hydrocarbons. Look in this setting here. What do you see that's not highly refined metals or plastics or stuff that is just thrown away after one use? How are you going to operate this helicopter, these hospitals, or the ambulance? Hospitals use about twice as much energy per square foot as an office building. Just tremendous energy suck. In 11 years, we got to redo half of this. Mining resources is another huge problem. The quality of resources that we have is diminishing. This isn't just oil and gas, it's copper, it's aluminum. Used to be you could just go over and scoop this stuff out of the ground. All the easy stuff is gone. It's getting harder all the time, requires more energy all the time to get. We have even larger emissions associated with trying to get the same stuff while we're trying to do more of this. Who doesn't have a cell phone? Who doesn't want a car that's in a third world country? All of these things require even more of the same stuff. Industrialization of everything we do is probably a factor. Other dependencies, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, what are they going to do if oil isn't being sold anymore to the world? 27 million people here. Currently, they need $80 a barrel for this stuff, and they're not getting it. They're taking on debt. A country with supposedly $34 trillion worth of assets in oil reserves. 11 years, they have to have half as much oil be taken out of their country. They're going to have some problems, and I expect their neighbors will too. Even here in the United States, if you go to West Virginia, these 15 gentlemen here, the median age is 45 years old. About 3/4 of them actually graduated from high school. The average income they make, just shy of $85,000 a year. Where do you know someone with just a high school education or less, for some of these gentlemen, can make $85,000 a year? They are not going to be happy that they're not producing coal like they are now. If half of them lose their jobs, and all of them lose their jobs over the next few years, or the next 20 years. Economics, we only got it, I'm almost there, we're getting there. Correlation between energy, the blue line, and GDP. I know GDP is not a great thing, but it's the best we have, and it's easy to come by. You'll notice the blue follows along quite nicely for the most part. It tends to precede GDP by a little bit, so as we bump up energy consumption, a little bit after that, we'll see better quarterly earnings, and people are buying more stuff, and it goes on and on. You'll also notice the difference between these two is greater. Energy was lower back here, and they get a little bit tighter in recent years. Few reasons for that. One is efficiency. It's harder to come by efficiency. Motors can only get so good. Power plants can only get so good. This was actually much greater if you go back, to like the 1950s, the span between the two of them. The other factor is, wasn't going to go here tonight, but energy is not as good as it used to be. We're using more energy to get energy out of the ground. That causes our whole society, the whole system to kind of grind a little bit. Things aren't working as well as they used to. This is a different way of looking at the same information, plotting instead of going together. We're looking at how much energy and oil equivalent versus trillions of dollars. And this is an amazingly tight correlation. That doesn't mean they cause one another. I'm not going there, but it is strongly suggestive that there is an incredible link between these two. Here's a big one, the petrodollar. I'm not sure if many of you even heard of this. I'm going to read this right off my script. The US dollar was based on gold since the World War II Bretton Woods Agreement. Decades later, as the Vietnam War waged on, and the US dollar weakened, the US severed the gold dollar link to avoid further ongoing conversion of US dollars for gold. The US was selling, people were saying, hey, France would come in and say, here's some money for you, we want your gold. We depleted about half of that in short order. In 1973, to prevent further devaluation of the dollar and to protect the status of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, President Nixon made an agreement with Saudi Arabia to buy and sell oil using US dollars. This strategic cooperation was a significant development in the history of the fiat currency system because it established the dollar as the de facto currency for world trade. This effectively ensured the US dollar became the reserve currency for global trades in virtually all the commodities and goods because foreign banks were forced to use the dollar as a form of international exchange for oil and other imports. Massive demand for US dollars ensued and pushed up the value of the dollar. The US dollar has the unique privilege of being the only currency in the world with which oil could be purchased, making it the universal benchmark currency. This enabled the United States to do all sorts of things that any other country couldn't do. We racked up an incredible deficit, and on and on and on. Likely, without oil or with a diminished role for oil in the future, this link will be severed. The US dollar status, the world's reserve currency, will end and the value of the US dollars will plummet, as will dollar-denominated assets. Your pensions will go down, your spending power of your bank accounts are going to go down, your ability to buy cheap anything from the rest of the world will fail. US lifestyle and consumption patterns will be greatly reduced from what we are accustomed to. This is a problem. This is probably going to happen at some point in the future regardless of what we do with oil, but this will just bring it along that much faster. This is pretty much the last thing I got going here. This is about us, all of us in the room. You've probably heard of, I know some of you have heard of, I've talked to you about the marshmallow experiment that was done in the 1970s with kids. You give them a marshmallow, sit on the table and say, if you can let that sit there for 10 minutes, I'll come back and I'll give you 2. Some kids can do it, some kids can't. It's really a challenging thing for kids. It's actually a challenging thing for adults too. When they do these experiments with humans, they use money. With pigeons and rats, they use food, obviously, because that's the reward. Interesting thing is, though, when they do this with humans, if they use food, the curve comes down. We're more like the other animals. Dollars are just a little less tangible to us. Nice thing is they're discounting the future at incredibly rapid rates. This is in seconds. For us, it's months. That means we discount the future at about 1.5% a month. That works out to about 16% a year, 43%, or a little over 50% in 5 years, and by over 80% in 10 years. Discounting the future is a huge problem. If something is valuable to you today, you need to have something at least 5 times greater than that to wait to 2030. That's the year where things matter. So if you don't sense that something is worth 5 times more than it is to you right now, you know, buying that new, latest, greatest cell phone today, you know, what's the cost of that? It's not particularly tangible and it's a long way off. It's a good thing to do. How easy is it to deny our biology? We're only about 8 generations into this industrialized thing so far. And it's only about 500 generations since we've been doing farming. If you were to find one of those, the parents of the first farmers, the last hunter-gatherer, if there was such a thing, and you dissected their brain and you dissected any of our brains, there's no material difference. They were trying to avoid saber-toothed tigers and dinosaurs, whatever was running around at the time. They had immediate needs that they had to focus on. And if they didn't, some serious bad things could happen to them. Super wicked problem. We are faced with super wicked problems everywhere. Time is running out. The other factor is there's no central authority. There's no one in charge of what we're trying to do. And the people that are trying to solve the problems, we're also creating the problems that, we're dependent upon these systems ourselves. And of course that last one, where the policies we have strongly discount the future. We see that all over the place. So fortunately or unfortunately, we will become serious as time goes on. Some of these obstacles that I point out, regardless of how daunting they may seem, will be dealt with in the near future, as lowering greenhouse gas emissions is not our only pressing concern. The world economies are completely reliant on perpetual growth, which requires ever-expanding resource streams that we've been talking about, or I've been talking about. Many key resources, copper, nickel, zinc, oil, coal, are at lower grade than they were just a generation ago. All of the gains in oil production over the past decade are from oil wells with much lower energy return on energy invested. All those tar sands, all those shale oils, a lot more energy goes into that. They're terrible from many standpoints. a lot of emissions happening because of the extraction of these things, and they just don't have the value to society as earlier fuels did. The coal situation is similar to, it's just lower grades going forward. Unfortunately, there are copious amounts of these things still available, but investments in these things will eventually wither away, as these energy sources just can't provide enough net energy for us to keep doing. As in war, we will not only need to prioritize going forward, we will need to make significant sacrifices. With realistic plans and reasonable ideas of some of the things that we're facing, hopefully, in a little good luck, we may be able to choose mostly what we're going to sacrifice. This is tough for me. I'm not looking forward to getting up here and kind of presenting stuff like this, but I had my time. My wife said, don't pull any punches, and here I am. So hardships are probably going to be hitting even some of us in this room, certainly our offspring. But hardship isn't necessarily, we all try to avoid it, but if you haven't read Sebastian Junger's book, Tribe, I recommend everyone here read the thing. It talks about people in war, people that have had to sacrifice all sorts of things they didn't want to. Sebastian says in his book, humans don't mind hardship. In fact, they thrive on it. What they mind is not feeling necessary. Modern society has perfected the art of making people not feel necessary. If things are anywhere close to what I'm talking about, I think we're all going to feel extremely necessary going forward. And while I haven't talked about anything on the local level, as Jerry indicated this was all about this evening, that's really where I'm hoping all of you will put your focus. It's the people in this room, the people that you see every day. That's where we need to be investing things, and paying attention to even just a few of the things I mentioned, I think is probably the way to go. So that's all I have. I didn't do too bad. I'm about 5-10 minutes over.
Good show. So go ahead.
Is Tribe by Sebastian Junger. I think I have it on here. Yeah, right there. Tribe, Homecoming and Belonging.
Okay.
Jerry's lent it out to a few people.
I've got 2 copies now.
Okay.
I have 2 copies now.
So if there's any discussion that you'd like to have now after that, while Bruce is kind of getting ready to set up and have a cup of coffee, feel free to do that. And or think about what you'd like to say in a discussion after the completion of the talks. Got a basket for donations for this space. So whatever's put in here will be for the UU and hosting this. And we certainly appreciate whatever you might be able to do. Congratulations.
So what I'm going to give you is the same story told by a different person. Okay? So it isn't really brighter, it's different. And well, you can decide for yourself. So from Scott, and like Scott, I'm trying to keep us on time. It's very difficult to discuss this in a rapid manner because I'm sure it's raising 100 questions in your mind as we speak. Hopefully we'll have time to have more discussion afterwards, and I'll have some questions to ask you during the presentations here. It may bring some more focus to it as well. So as Scott said, and as we all know, things are going to change. And even if we were uniquely successful in stopping the increase in atmospheric carbon today, things are still going to change. So most of my discussion will focus on just one response to atmospheric carbon, and that is our use of fossil fuels. So I'm going to try to first bring Scott's presentation down to a more local level. So here's the local level. This is the National Climate Assessment that came out last fall for the Northeast region. That's us. We can expect 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit warmer by 2035. centigrade, that you're over 2 degrees centigrade. And to kind of put that into perspective that makes it easier to understand, 3.6 degrees doesn't sound like much. For every 2 degrees in temperature rise, 4 feet of sea level rise. So we're talking about 7 to 8 feet of sea level rise by 2035. This, if it happens, will be the largest increase. We in the Northeast will experience the largest increase of any place in the contiguous United States. And we'll experience it as much as 2 decades before the rest of the country reaches this average temperature. We are not literally in the hot seat, but we are in the wet seat, as we'll talk about later on. This is Nags Head, North Carolina. Those houses are not displaced by a hurricane. They're displaced by sea level rise. You can see the whole front row of houses there is now half afloat, where they used to have a line of dunes in front of them. So let's look at how we're doing on climate change. Scott has already covered this very well. This is where we're going. This is where the curve is going. It's going in the wrong direction. We are not doing our part to address climate change. So if you want to think about significantly reducing our emissions in the next year, what would you suggest? What's your idea for what we might do here to change that direction?
An idiot with a plan can accomplish 10 times as much as a genius without one.
Okay.
We need a plan,
So
and
we
then we
need
need
a
to work
plan.
the plan.
Yeah, go ahead, Sheila.
Well, it's a very complicated problem, so it's going to take many different solutions.
Right.
Not one, which is part of why it's so hard to accept.
Yes, it is. And it really puts the emphasis on a local response too. As Scott's pointed out a couple of times, there is nobody in the chair at the end of the table directing us at this point. Let's look at a couple of things that we do in Vermont that might be subject to mitigating circumstances, things that we might change. Most of our greenhouse gases, almost half of them, come from our transportation in the state of Vermont. About a quarter of them approximately come from residential heating fuel, burning of carbon fuels. So carbon fuels are a big part of what we might take as a response to the problem. If we're going to do something, transportation and home heating might be places that we'd start. Now, right now, we generate about 40, well, we don't generate, but about 40% of our electricity comes from renewables, mostly from Hydro-Quebec. So if you think about, well, you know, maybe we could transfer these to electric cars, maybe that would be a good solution. But our electric grid right now will not support the amount of renewables that we already produce, because they're produced in a distributed way, and the grid that we have does not support that kind of production. It's still focused on centralized production. So even if we developed a lot more solar and wind power within the state, right now we couldn't distribute it on a scale that would help us reduce our transportation needs. If that takes place over time, we have an opportunity to work on the grid as well. Right now, our per capita emissions are not too bad, about 13 metric tons a year. That makes us about 2/3 of the US average. My point here is really that, as Scott has pointed out, if we don't make some step in bending that curve, there are going to be immeasurable consequences, and they're going to come sooner than we think. What we're doing now is not enough. Now, one of the most common rebuttals you get to any kind of action on the climate is we're a small state. We can have even an insignificant impact on the overall problem of climate change. And that's probably true. But let's look at some other things that the impact of our use of fossil fuels is doing to us. Right now, to buy that oil, there's an economic impact. $2.5 billion is going out of our economy annually to buy oil from other places. That's $2.5 billion that we could be using to develop renewables, to improve our electricity grid, to hire contractors or pay contractors to weatherize our houses. We're pretty good on energy consumption. We're 45th in the States, but we're 47th in energy production, and almost all of that's electricity. That leaves us with this deficit. And where does the money come from that goes into buying that heating oil? Well, from maple syrup, from dairying and agriculture, from hospitality industries, all of which are going to be negatively affected by climate change. So the chances of this disparity in coming up with the money to buy the fossil fuels is going to be more difficult as time goes on. So let's look at another item here. Health impacts. One of the things that appeared briefly on one of Scott's slides was black carbon. Right now, worldwide, black carbon is attributed, about 2 billion deaths a year are attributed to black carbon. 5 to 6 million people have their lives shortened by it. It's that particulate matter from diesel engines, from cook fires, from the burning of coal, that's affecting our health. Wouldn't improving our atmosphere be a worthwhile goal if there were no climate change to worry about? So we're also talking about just in that one area, that's just black carbon. We aren't talking about the effect of volatile organics. We're not talking about traffic accidents. We're not talking about any of the other tangential costs we pay for burning fossil fuel. There's also energy security. 40% of our electricity, as I say, comes from Canadian hydro. The hydroelectric industry is worried about the amount of precipitation and rainfall we're going to have in the Northeast. It's supposed to increase by 30% by some models by the end of the century. That is not good for hydroelectric production, especially if you're a small producer like the paper mill here or the power plant on the Black River in Springfield. Siltation, scouring of the riverbeds like we experienced during Irene is very hard on production and will take those small power plants out of production for periods of time. Well, it also makes us subject, of course, to fossil fuel price fluctuations, market speculation, political upheavals. All of those would be worse or would be improved if we had more local production. And we can produce renewables here, biomass, wind energy, solar energy. We know that we can produce a much greater part of our energy needs here. And that would make us more secure in our future. The last thing I'm going to mention is there's an impact of our use of fossil fuels on some of our freedoms and well-being. How many of you currently ride a bicycle, as I do, for local transportation, commuting or running errands? Anybody here? Okay, got a couple. How many of you would like to? Why don't you? The reason you don't is because of the cars on the street and the way our roadways have been built to serve motorized vehicles. That's also the reason you don't take the bus, because we don't devote any money to public transportation. And there's a third factor here that I think that enters here and becomes more apparent every year. We don't hold our motor vehicle drivers to a very high standard of accountability for negligence. And you may think that's a strange statement. Well, you know, there's drug alcohol or blood alcohol laws and that sort of thing. Do we have the weakest blood alcohol standard in the civilized world? We're at 0.8. Practically every other country, including Argentina and Brazil, have 0.05.
In Honduras, the penalty is death for
Right.
driving.
And Lila told me when we visited in Sweden, suppose a person on a bicycle gets hit by a car. In Sweden, she says, you'll probably never drive again, even if the accident was the cyclist's fault. Our laws, we're paying many taxes for the use of motor vehicles as our prime mode of transportation, and it affects our freedom not to drive a car.
I took public transportation to Mount Snow this day and most every weekday.
Yep,
30 miles already paid for.
yep. And if you want to go to Brattleboro, you can make the connection there, but you have to change buses to do that. So, economic, healthcare, freedom, or energy security, freedom and well-being, all of those are reasons that I hope will convince people that it might be worth taking on the problems of climate change, or at least the reduction of our dependence on fossil fuels. And I hope there are arguments that you will make to other people as well. So let's talk about, we're in the midst of what people call the slow emergency. I think Jim Kunstler used that for the title of the book. We're dealing with a difficult kind of disaster. It happens slowly. And the descendants of an agricultural culture that began 8,000 years ago, we often, in the words of Hobbes, everything outside of that agricultural culture has always been seen as barbarism. Life being solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Okay? But the truth is that, we are finding through more archaeological exploration that quite often, dozens, maybe hundreds of times, there have been quiet revolutions that have proved Hobbes wrong, because people have decided on their own that the burdens of agriculture were not worth living with it. And they literally took off for the hills. You can think of the collapse of the Mayan civilization. You can think of dozens of other examples in Southeast Asia where people ran away from agriculture and the state-based, or the agricultural-based state systems that had evolved. What didn't they like about them? Well, there were environmental failures because they overstressed the land. There was conscription and slavery necessary for that physical labor that Scott was talking about that's required of agriculture compared to foraging and hunting, hunter-gatherers. There were the taxes. There, as I say, in addition to slavery to support the land, there was also conscription to support the armies because you were now sedentary and had to defend your wet rice fields or your maize fields. So people ran away, and they ran away to places where the sedentary agriculture, the state-based agriculture, doesn't work very well. They went to marginal lands. They went to inaccessible areas where it was very hard to bring them back again. And in general, they were better off. For some interim period until either the environment improved or a new state formed that had a different form of sustaining itself. It's interesting that in the archaeological records it's being shown that a lot of those societies were much more equitable. Some of them were basically leaderless and peaceful. The reason we have a picture of many of those so-called barbaristic society as being hostile and warlike is because the people who were coming outside and discovering them were outsiders. Within themselves, they've been operating for hundreds of years in very egalitarian settings. They felt that they had an equality of opportunity that they didn't have in the agricultural setting. So again, my point is that since the birth of agriculture, we've been through numerous cycles of state consolidation and dispersion. States have failed to deliver, and people have found ways to avoid their controls and shortcomings. Climate change can be seen as another failure of the state. And like many others, it can be seen as a consequence of exceeding the ability of the environment to support human activity. So here's a different perspective. Take it for what it's worth. So what are we trying to do? In the words of Paul Hawken in the book Drawdown, we're trying to avoid the unmanageable and to manage the unavoidable of climate change. To do that, we're going to need a resilient community. Most of us have an idea what a sustainable community is. It's one that interacts with environments in ways that can continue on, that aren't damaging to the environment. It has some sort of economic base that allows people to thrive and continue doing what they're doing, to generate value. And it's got a social structure that people see as bearable, as comfortable, and that they see as equitable. These are not dreams of people who are hypothesizing. This is what anthropologists have found are the necessities of a sustainable community. We have to go beyond that if we're going to address climate change and become a society that evolves, that can take on the adaptations that it's going to have to make based on the changes in the climate, respond to them, recover, and build a new organization that responds to that new environment. That's what evolution is all about. All of the speciation that we've discovered in the past is based on some change in the environment that the species had to adapt to. We're supposed to be smart. We're going to be tested on how fast we can evolve relative to geologic time in responding to some of these climate changes. So I'm going to reflect on these resiliency strategies from two ways. One you might call mobilization, which is sort of from the top down. One is mitigation, which is from the bottom up. Mobilization, I think Scott's made a good case for the idea that this is not a mobilization like Hurricane Irene. This is a mobilization like World War II, where everyone is involved, where everything you do has a calculation in it for how it supports the effort. Do you think we can do that? Do you think we have enough focus as a society to take on some level of sacrifice to combat this problem that we face? I'll leave the question open.
Military spending is where it is, and the enemy is other people.
Yes, and that military spending's not going to go down because there's likely to be a lot more political disruption that it's going to have to respond to. So mitigation is to try to improve our survival odds as a species and as individuals and as families, and to concentrate. To mitigate effectively, we need to concentrate on local knowledge and our immediate environment. I mean immediate environment, what we touch and see every day. And we'll also need to reduce conflict within our community. And we'll have to address the question of migration. New York Times listed 5 things that probably fall generally into the mobilization side of the spectrum. Rethink the farm. What we're really talking about in rethinking the farm is finding better ways to integrate the farm with the non-farm environment? How can the farm and pastoralism and forestry be combined or made better integrated so that they complement and improve each other rather than one having to be destroyed for the other? We'll have to build for the future and not for the past. My favorite example here, we had plenty of them after Irene, is if I go out and a road is washed out and I replace the culvert with the same size culvert that got washed out before, I'm not building for the future. And the price to do that is probably about the same as putting in a bigger culvert. Now, who pays for me putting in the smaller culvert? Not me necessarily, but my children. Because they're the ones who are going to have to cope with the next culvert failure. What we do now determines the sacrifices our children are going to have to make. Retreating from the coasts, okay? I'm not just talking about our coast. Obviously, the idea of offering flood insurance to people who want to build a house on a barrier island is ludicrous, and yet we do it. So we're going to have to somehow convince people that we need those barrier islands to do what they were doing before they were building houses on them. But another part of what's going to happen with the retreat from the coast with a 12-foot rise in sea level is what we're going to do with the people who are displaced by that flooding. One reason we want to retreat from the coast is to mitigate the catastrophic migrations that are going to happen as a consequence of that sea level rise. Enlist nature to help. Well, I think the first thing we think of there is photosynthesis, okay? Everyone's looking for a way to sequester carbon. I know a machine that will sequester carbon, generate oxygen, provide energy, and everybody knows what it is. It's a tree, okay? So the best thing we can do is try to enlist nature to help us with the problem we have here. And we do that, in order to do that, we're going to have to study a lot more closely how nature works and how it works right around us, right here. Studying nature, I think if I have a point in this presentation, it's that this is the critical element of our success, is to become more observant about what's going on immediately around us. And the last thing is expect the unexpected. Well, what might be some of the unexpecteds? Scott's already talked about, we're going to go from the most dense fuel source other than nuclear that we know of right now. We're going to talk about going from the most dense fuel source that we know of to a less dense fuel source in renewables. They take more land area. The energy's harder to store. All of these things are almost certain to result in an economic contraction. I just don't think there's any way around the idea, let alone as he's introduced the concept of the petrodollar, our current debt. Debt is a problem that we're going to have to address more and more because there's going to be more and more loss of goods from climate impact. You know the Pacific Gas and Electric may go bankrupt? The biggest power company in California may go bankrupt because of the liability it's incurred from the California forest fires. There isn't any real plausible reason to think that won't spread to more insurance companies that have been building reserves for years, but not for the level of catastrophe that we may encounter. And it could even extend to state governments. The other item I've referred to already is the continuous refugee migrations, which are likely to occur as more and more people are displaced based on climate problems. There's right now 68 million displaced persons in the world, 25 million of them considered refugees, 40 million of them displaced from their homes in their own country, and another 3 million seeking asylum. This is the highest level of human displacement we've ever known, including the world wars. Here's a question for you. I got plenty of questions. I don't have any answers. What do you think is the ethical response to climate refugees? What should be the rights of the refugee? What are the rights of the host? When a climate event results in a displacement, who is liable? If you want to see the most primitive, crude discussion of this ethical question, it's going on our Mexican border right now. This leads to another thing. I'll address this. Disputes over property. What is property? Right now, the U.S. has the most absolute constitutional definition of property of any country in the world. There are other countries who do not view property in the same absolute way that we do. Finland, it's impossible to trespass in Finland because everyone has the right to cross other people's property. You can't shoot any of the game, you can't cut down any trees, but other than that, you can go on their property. In China, there's this weird relationship of, well, what does the state own and what do people own? It can change overnight depending on the action of the Central Committee. Okay, so let's drop back for a second and look at this question. If you are a person who is skeptical about climate change, especially anthropogenic climate change, this is the kind of talk that drives you crazy. Okay? You're talking about inverting everything we've inherited from English law and is part of our culture for something that may or may not ever happen. I don't know how you counter that argument. And the other thing that makes people feel that way, I don't mean to make it them and us, all of us can feel that way, is that we really don't have any other social constructs that we enforce in our society that make anything look any different. But I can tell you that this absolute view of property rights is going to get in our way when we need flexibility in order to adapt to climate change. Part of being resilient is going to be being flexible in how we address these questions of migration and what our individual rights are. Flexibility is the key to the ability to adapt and be a resilient community. We need to be able to evaluate our assumptions in order to be flexible. Okay, I promise you something more positive now. Mobilization, we talk about big things that you can do. This is one of the things that I think is the most fascinating projects that I've heard about recently. The Netherlands are planning to make all of their residential housing in the country net zero. And they're going to do it without anybody having to pay any upfront costs. Here's how it works. The government puts up $50 million in seed money. Mostly what that money does is pay the electric companies to keep producing because they're going to take away all their electric bills. All the money from the residents' electric bills are going to go into this consortium of builders, manufacturers, contractors, designers, who are going to come up with a set of standardized components to convert any residents in a particular region of the Netherlands to net zero. They're going to build a centralized factory to get the mass production economies of scale. And they're going to train installers to install it. So they're going to come to your house, and in 1 week, they are going to turn your house from its current condition into net zero housing. That's their design goal. They have the pilot project on now. The idea is then, once these houses are now net zero, you don't have any electric bill anymore. But you keep paying it for a year or so to cover the cost of the component installation in your house. This is big thinking. This is the kind of mobilization that allows you to actually make some kind of meaningful accommodation to the changes we're going to see. Here's another one. World Resources Institute publishes an atlas of forest landscape restoration opportunities. This is a worldwide atlas that shows places that would be amenable to increasing forestation. And a lot of the light green you see here is mosaic restoration. That's what they call it. This is the kind of integration of agricultural, pastoral, and forest uses that will still increase the total forest coverage by massive amounts across the world. They've surveyed and indexed where the places are that might be likely to do this, and it's available to you at their website, which I highly recommend. They are thinking on a global scale, and they're analyzing the resources that we're going to have to work with as climate change progresses. So, looking at other things related to mitigation, what will we do on the local level? Well, first thing I would say is get together. Join a congregation. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a religious congregation, although I think one thing you can learn from religious congregations is they often know a lot about building communities. But whatever your source of learning about building community, I hope you'll find a way to join it or expand your knowledge of it. The second thing is be ungoverned. Now, I'm not talking anarchy here. What I'm talking about is don't let the government or the higher level institution get in the way of things you might do locally. Don't be governed to the extent that you're dependent on the decisions of others. Figure out what you can do around the government. That also means being skeptical of the government's plans in many cases. Who do those plans really serve? We need to be ungoverned in our thinking and look for actions that we can take without government support. Be persistently observant. What I'm talking about here is getting outside and looking at how the climate is changing, looking at what is happening as nature responds. Nature is going to take positive steps. Nature is going to be damaged in other ways. Look closely to see what we might be able to do to promote the good things and to limit the damage. I've often had this idea that everybody, when they're like in second grade in school, ought to be assigned 1 square yard of dirt someplace. And it's your responsibility to go out there 4 times a year and see what's happened to it. And to journal next year about what's happened to it, and next year, until you're 75 years old. That's a kind of repository of knowledge, when shared, that could teach us a lot about what we could do here finally, I'm sorry, so we want to be the last one's be lazy. Okay, a little sarcastic, but what I'm trying to say is, there's a lot of things you're probably doing right now that might be better off not done. Like maintaining your lawn. Or tilling your garden with a rototiller. Absolutely wasted effort. But there's also this little factor, things that where laziness might be a better choice, are about ambition. When you go outside and influence the environment around you, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to understand and complement what's going on in the environment? Or are you trying to exploit it? If you're trying to exploit it, maybe you ought to be lazy instead. Okay, things to look for. Local successes and wisdom. Share the information. When you have a success, tell people about it. Make sure the newspaper knows about it. Share information and look to others for ideas. Look for how your local nature is responding to the changes that are being imposed upon it. And rely on profoundly understood tools as opposed to higher levels of ecology. Not many of us really know how a smartphone works, but a lot of us know how a shovel works. Though I will tell you that this summer when I built a stone wall, I found out more about what a pickaxe is really good for than I ever knew before. And it's that kind of intimate engagement that allows you to do good without doing harm. So we're looking for how nature's adapting. We're looking for what our neighbors are doing. We're looking for profound understanding of what's going on in the environment around us. Vermont has a heritage of that. If you've ever been to the Billings Farm in Woodstock, George Marsh and Frederick Billings recovered an absolutely disastrous farm and made it into a showcase by studying what was going on there. And they said solutions arise from practice and place, from people who know the land. And now I'm going to give you an example of a local project that I think is an excellent example of what I'm talking about. Jerry Bird goes out and says, we got these roofs that would be great solar collectors. And we could generate more electricity than we need. And if we can do it here on the UU Meeting House, we could also do it over at St. Peter's. He didn't wait for government support. He championed the project himself. He had the knowledge and contacts to move it forward. And he even accepted things that might not have turned out exactly as he wanted. Okay? You may not be able to get everything, but you can get a lot. So in the end, we all have to decide. We have to decide today, and we have to decide every day. We should have decided 60 years ago, but we didn't. But now we have to decide. Doing nothing, or the minimum that's acceptable to everyone, is unfortunately the most likely course that we're going to follow. And we will have to work against that if we want more than that. I hope some of the data that I presented about the economic, health, security, and well-being outcomes that we might gain from working on climate change will be of value to you, especially when talking to others. We have a consistently developing picture, as Scott has presented, of what future is likely. But that's a picture nonetheless. We have a much less distinct picture of what we can do. And we have to develop that vision ourselves. Do you have any questions?
I have a couple of things that are happening in this community. One is that this Saturday, Lisa from Mighty Food Farm is coming here to talk about local agriculture and lots more. I think it will touch on a lot of these kinds of things. That's from starting at 1 o'clock, Saturday the 23rd here. And another is you spoke about changes in agriculture. There is a very small project at the McWaters Garden, McWaters Park in North Bennington, right along the Walloomsac River, to create a permaculture garden, which is a very different way of thinking about gardening, which uses local native plants to create an environment that is productive and an asset to the environment. So there are like 6 people working on it, and so it goes very slowly. But if people are interested, we welcome other people coming. So that's just 2 little things.
Thank you. Others? Linda?
I have a question. Why is it that the Northeast will be having more rain sooner than the other areas?
I couldn't tell you why. I'm only saying that the models that have been developed so far predict that, just as they predict more drought in the Great Plains and in California. They also predict, it's just patterns of rainfall changing due to the influence of climate.
Part of that goes back to what Scott was talking about as far as the changes in, Scott, would you like to speak to that as far as the changes in the way the flow goes? Because that gives a sense.
There's an expectation that the westerly winds that we're used to are going to just slow down, break down. Instead of going more, which way are we facing here? Instead of going west to east, there are going to be more undulations and so on. And based on where colder ocean water is or colder land masses are and stuff like that, you will tend to get things parked in certain areas. So that would be my guess as to the reason why the Northeast might be a little more wet and the Midwest and further south would be drier.
And James Lovelock actually foretold that maybe 50 years ago, that this would be one of the best places to live in this upcoming time that we are, which is why, one of the reasons I moved here.
I would say that, it may be better than drought, but too much water carries its own burdens.
Yeah, and I would say, I think those of us that have solar are seeing that the last couple of months. It's been hard. We haven't gotten as much from it. And my husband and I are close to net zero. We have ground source geothermal, and that's run by electricity, but certainly not much. But then we have a solar array, but it's a tracker, so it gives us more bang for the buck, so to speak.
Per square foot.
And we had to buy more solar through community solar because we weren't quite getting enough. But we've been paying more the last couple of months because of the clouds.
It's been a very difficult winter for solar collection. Yes, Chuck?
So let me, as you talked, I thought about this scenario about New York and Boston and Portsmouth and these coastal communities. Suddenly, New York, Manhattan being about 300 yards wide, and I wonder, and okay, I get accused of being an optimist. If one of the impacts of probably a gradual migration of people away from the coast is that they move to the Piedmont, they move to higher ground.
Yep.
And what they're moving to almost inevitably is going to be older rural communities that have been left in the backwaters because people have moved to the city. So here in Bennington, we have an incredibly old housing stock. Lots of old, inefficient houses. So what happens is, in a gradual migration, probably some of it assisted by government, but some of it just the migration of jobs, the migration of economies, Bennington grows to be 25 or 35,000 people. And we infill the communities with a denser and better built housing and more modern built housing that allows for greater efficiency, because I think in one respect urban areas allow for greater public transit, allow for just better use of resources than an urban in a rural environment where we've got people who are commuting. When you go to the hospital employee parking lot, half the license plates are from New York State. People driving in from Pittsdown and Hoosick and who knows where else. So eventually, I wonder if that sort of migration and the changing economics of what have been Rust Belt rural communities will in fact change. Because people are moving here because they're going to be away from, the coast when the coast gets inundated. That just, a certain amount of stuff I think is going to happen. I mean, it would be better if it were planned. It would be better if there were, good constructs for how to make it happen, but some of it will happen anyway.
Yeah.
It'll happen.
Certainly, lots of things are going to happen. And the fact of the matter is, right now, cities are much more energy efficient than rural areas. Transportation, the literal surface area of the buildings compared to its volume. So, but what I want to keep our eye on, I'm not against any of those things. What I want to keep our eye on is how's that affecting the pieces of ground around us? How's that affecting the natural environment that is going to have to deal with different, if not larger, stresses than it's had in the past? That's something that only we can do locally. It will do us no good to hear about energy solutions or farming solutions that work in West Texas. We've got to study what is around us, including what is going to happen with whatever immigration we have in the area. That's all I'm saying. Yes?
So like the past year, I think it's been, the jobs market in Bennington has dropped 60%. But however, I'd like to see, teaching the kids about this stuff on the matter, because they are the future. They're going to be the ones that are going to live after that. So, educating them with everything. I'd like to see programs for the kids in school, at the high school, for like the tutorial center, for having agricultural programs for kids to actually learn, so that way they can get into it while they're young still, and then as the future progresses and the weight of the world starts to grow, they can actually have a sense of what to do when it's time to do it. Also, for the whole climate change scenario, this is just an opinion followed by some research. We tend to focus on the beginning. Like if you're watching stocks or a market, we watch the patterns of the market. But sometimes if you're kind of new to trading, you'll watch just like about a good like year or less than that portion of the history, so you can learn the way that it goes afterwards. The same thing with these markets. We look back with these graphs. We look back only to the 80s and the 50s, but to really understand the fluctuation of temperature with the Earth, we have to understand farther back, which is why I feel 26,000 years prior, as this shift happens naturally. The Earth does go through climate change. It does naturally do this. However, just us adding to it this time around is not making it better.
Right.
But we're at the time of history, which is present now, where we're at the top, almost getting hotter and hotter. But it's usually, like I said earlier to someone else, it's usually what follows after the heating is what we have to be concerned about, which is the cooling.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's really important to address the young. They are the ones that have to deal with this mostly afterwards. So put them in such programs as such, or create programs to have authentic teachings of these things and I think that's important, especially for the startup. I'm not from here. I'm from New York, but I love Vermont. I've been here for probably, I've been in the area for 15 years, but after high school, I ran into a friend from high school who went to Belgium, came back, and told me about these designs that he's trying to work on for energy himself. So it's like everyone's getting a piece of the pie. Everyone's trying to do their thing. It's not just now, but I like what you said about focusing on individual experience, focusing on what's right here, right now, because each group has to focus on that in order to be able to build up to the whole potential of I'm not saying that we can't turn back, because we've already done enough destruction as it is. But it doesn't mean it's too late to actually, kind of like keep things as they are and have things dissipate over time. There's a lot. There's so much to take into consideration. A lot of factors that play into it, and
It's very difficult to try
change.
to come up with any comprehensive picture, because it's really, as Scott said, it's a super difficult problem. It has so many facets that it's just beyond our ability to deal with it and comprehend it as human beings. And I like the idea of educating the young. There is a saying in the Peace Corps that the first people you want to convince of new methodology are the young. They'll take care of educating the old.
Marsh, go ahead.
I just wanted to invite all of you to Climate Advocates Bennington. You were talking about the importance of community, and the second Wednesday of every month up at the Congregational Church on Hillside Street, people from all around the area are working together and have been for several years to impact as much as we can what's happening in our personal lives as well as our communal lives. We meet at 7 o'clock, and Bruce and Judy and Bill and others are working with the town to create an energy committee that starts addressing all these issues in terms of the way our community functions. So it would be lovely to have any of you who would like to continue these conversations to have them with us.
Definitely, and it's highly recommended. I mean, what Marsh is bringing up here is not necessarily the congregation of a religious community, but also the fact of a community actually happening and becoming part of it in one way or another. Bill?
Next Monday night, the select board meets. They're going to receive a proposal at that time to reestablish the Energy Committee. The Energy Committee was established back in 2003, and that's one of the reasons why our statistics are so much better than the rest of the nation. Because Bennington actually got together and did a lot of really good stuff, but you sort of slow down. Well, there's another coming together, a convergence of energy where we really need to devote the next few years to the next stage. It's like the second half of the Super Bowl. We need to return to the game and finish the job. And that energy committee is gonna be formed, and there's gonna be a lot of expertise on there, and there's gonna be stuff happening. And hopefully the whole community will come back together and will make the effort necessary to at least pursue the dream, and who knows, all things are possible.
6 o'clock next Monday, if you have, we'll actually make the time. Just come.
And where is it, Jerry?
It's gonna be at the firehouse, at the select board meeting. So you may have to listen to a couple of things that may not be of interest to you, but hang in there. It'll be worthwhile to be part of the presentation for the Energy Committee as well as the select board's response to it. I guess one of the things I'd like to close with, unless does anybody else have anything? Is that Bruce and Scott, to me, highlighted our predicament extremely well, which is why I asked them, and I've been in conversation with them for years about this. But two of the highlights to me that are most important is this community building, which is what I'm vehemently after. One of the components of that is to not necessarily have a judgment about how somebody else perceives a particular circumstance. What I've discovered in working with through groups that don't necessarily go together is that as I'm open, as I begin to listen to them from their point of view, that I can actually bring together some sort of a workable situation that hasn't existed before. So what I'm saying is, know your friends, know your neighbors, find an organization that is compatible with you and maybe not compatible. But join. Find out what your skills are, what you can do for your community, and share them, just like Bruce and Scott have been saying. So basically drop your I-ness, become enlightened, and serve our community. Thank you all.